All right, let's do it. The third one today. It feels exhausting, which is weird because I talk all the time, but here we go. Also, let's not think about the order. All right, so it's contemporary issues review time. Normally these will be live, however, because it's Thursday and I didn't really think through the fact that literally all of the other teachers have their Zoom classes today, that would not line up. Well, we're just gonna do it as a YouTube video. We've got a moderate amount of stuff to get through, so I'll try and keep the pace going fairly quickly and give you a feel for what review days will look like. And with that in mind, we'll get right into it. So you guys have been talking about gun rights for a while now, and pretty much the past 2 weeks has all been about looking at what exactly gun rights and gun violence looks like here in the United States. I've had you look at both the mass shootings as well as just general gun violence, because that's worth considering, and then some laws from some key states. And what I would like to do is just kind of unpack some of the key information I wanted you to take away from each of those assignments, the key kind of messages behind them. To give you a feel for what I'm going to talk about today, we're going to specifically be outlining some of the major questions that you need to be answering. I realized that we never really outright said, like, what am I asking from you other than, like, do you think we need more gun control? And that's really broad and not super specific. So I wanted to give you some concrete questions that hopefully you are trying to answer in kind of like a very, very short branching tree of decisions. From there, I'm going to talk about some patterns that you should have hopefully picked up on from mass shootings when we broke those down that are pervasive across all mass shootings. And then we're going to look at some patterns in actual gun violence. And then lastly, we're going to draw some conclusions from the U.S. gun laws that I had you look at. So California, Illinois, and Nevada, however you want to say it. And then from there, I'll just kind of give you a preview of next week. And there were no questions, so I won't address any of those today. Cool. Let's do it. So major questions to answer. In reality, with this unit, there are two big questions that you're trying to answer. The first one being, why do we have a gun violence problem? Not do we, because we do. Like that's a well-established fact. Like here in the United States, we have the most mass shootings per any Western country. And on top of that, our gun violence rate is much higher than all of our neighbors. So obviously, like, there's something. So why is it happening? Hopefully looking at this data will start to direct you into areas as to reasoning why that might be taking place. And then from there, where the branching decision comes is, can gun control help solve that problem? So like once we identify why it's happening, do we think that any sort of gun control or gun restrictions would help resolve that issue? And so what it boils down to is where you stand on this idea of, can gun control help? If your answer is yes, if after all this data and all of these samples that we're looking at, you get this innate feeling that, yeah, there is a gun problem and I think gun control is the correct solution, then we need to start narrowing down, okay, how does gun control solve this problem? So specifically, you need to answer the two questions. Do we have adjust who has access, and do we adjust what we have access to? And so what I mean by that is, when I say adjust who has access, I'm referring to the idea of what are our requirements for someone to be able to own a firearm in the United States. You need to look at what we currently have and then decide, do we need to be more strict with that, or do we need to adjust who is not being added to it? So for example, if you think it is a mental health problem, do we have enough restrictions for people with diagnosable mental health problems to not have access to them? Or alternatively, do we not have enough steps for them to identify that they have a mental health problem? Things like that. For adjusting what we have access to, if you conclude that it's not so much who has the gun as to like the types of firearms that are made available is the problem, then what sort of restrictions do we need to have? Do we need to say no more shotguns? Do we need to say no more bump stocks? Do we need to say no more high capacity magazines? Where do you stand on that if your answer is yes? So those are the kind of questions you need to be answering if you say yes, gun control can help solve this problem. If you say no, then what you need to be looking for is, if gun control can't solve this problem, what does? So if our problem is the fact that, not the fact that lots of people have access to guns or the type of guns, and it's just that there's a mental health problem, like, okay, cool. So if restricting guns doesn't fix that, what does? You need to be thinking about that. You need to be looking at what kinds of people are committing these crimes and what sort of structure can we put in place to assist them. And then on top of that, how do you enact those solutions? So what process do you go through to actually carry that out? Because it's one thing to say like, oh, well, we're just gonna give people more mental health assistance. Like, okay, how? What does that look like? Do we have more screening? Do we have better access to psychologists? Or do we have better access to medication? Like, give me something concrete. And your answers to these questions are what all of this data is supposed to be helping you come to. So like, you are supposed to be narrowing down, this is where the core problem is, and so this is what I think would be the effective solution. So with that in mind, the idea of looking for effective solutions, let's get into the mass shootings and what they can tell us themselves. So first and foremost, you should have hopefully noticed that one of the constants in mass shootings in the United States is that many perpetrators are mentally ill or have some sort of mental illness. The University of Texas shooter had a tumor in his brain that gave him violent impulses. The San Ysidro shooter repeatedly asked for mental health assistance and was ignored. The Columbine shooters, it is believed by the FBI investigations that they suffered from depression and other mental health issues. The Orlando shooter was reported by his ex-wife to have violent, abusive tendencies prior to this shooting. So there are lots of signs in these that the person who perpetrates this is suffering from something other than just like being angry. Many perpetrators also demonstrate signs of potential violence. So lots of them have also, about half of the ones you looked at, there was some indicator that this person was going to engage in violence prior to the actual mass shooting. In San Ysidro, again, the dude literally walked up to people and was like, I'm going to kill people. And they're like, oh, you. Columbine, they had lots of posts that were violent in nature. They had viewed a lot of violent websites and Medium and engaged in like taking pictures with guns and like things that are signs of violent behavior. And then again, in the Orlando situation, apparently, I put potentially by the Orlando ones because it hasn't been super confirmed if he was actually like that or if his wife is just like, oh yeah, he was abusive. Yeah, like after the fact, once he was a bad person, or if he actually was abusive. But if that were the case, like again, that is a violent tendency. Domestic abuse is usually a recurring thing. Like you don't hit your wife once and you're like, yeah, okay, I learned my lesson. I shouldn't do that. Usually you're a repeat offender because you have aggressive or violent tendencies. Many perpetrators as well have legal certification to own firearms. So in 4 out of the 6 that you looked at, or sorry, yeah, 4, all of the people that perpetrated the act of mass violence acquired a number of their firearms legally. They passed whatever requirements there were in order to purchase their weapons. So it wasn't like they acquired them illegally, like they went through traditional means. And that should link back to the other ones. Again, this should be thinking about your questions. Like, okay, so does that tell you that there's a problem with who we let have access to guns? Ooh, I'm stumbling over my words. You know, you make a script and an outline for these, and then you goof it up anyway. It's like it's live, which is silly because I probably should edit these when they're not live. Anyway, getting back to the topic, they acquired them legally. So what does that tell you? What sort of problems does that potentially allude to in how our system works? Or maybe there aren't problems and like they did a good job of background checks and this just came out of nowhere. And so it should have been after the fact once they started to show the violent tendencies. Again, all things to be thinking about. From there, with the actual weapons, automatic modifications and rifles are associated with higher loss of life. Generally speaking, wherever the most violent mass shootings occur in U.S. history, they involve primarily a rifle or multiple rifles, and then also some sort of modification. In the Las Vegas shooting, where 59 people were killed and way more than that were injured, the individual had been using a bump stock, which allowed him to modify his semi-automatic rifles to fire in an automatic fashion, despite the fact that that was initially prohibited. And he acquired those legally. In Orlando, the individual used a semi-automatic rifle for the majority of his shooting until the end when he was running out, and then he switched to a handgun. And that one had 50 killed with another 52 wounded, the 2 more deadly shootings in U.S. history. Along with that, we see that handguns are used in a majority of shootings. For our purposes, they were used in every single one. Every single mass shooting you looked at, they had a handgun or multiple handguns. So again, data to keep in mind. These are common characteristics of guns, and there are types of people that use them for mass shootings in the United States. For gun violence now, moving towards how those statistics and what they can tell us. You guys had a map, excuse me, and you had recorded statistics about actual gun violence. Going based off the map, some patterns you should hopefully have seen in the map is that, one, areas with less strict gun laws have higher rates of gun violence. And now when we say rates, what we're referring to is that sense of per 100,000 people, how many are killed with a firearm. So for example, Montana, Missouri, Alabama, they all scored Fs on the gun laws and like overall quality of gun laws. So they have very loose restrictions according to the gun violence database. And they had the 3 highest rates of gun violence at 18.9, 19, and 21.8 people per 100,000 being killed with firearms. That's compared to, say, at California, where you see 7.7, and they had an A for gun control. So they have very strict gun laws, and they're kind of like the poster child of strict gun laws. So looser gun laws appear to correlate with higher rates of gun violence. Along with that, you also see southern and western states have higher rates of gun violence as well. If you look at Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi, those 3 states have the highest rates of gun violence in the United States at 21.8, 19, and then I believe the other one was 18.9. So they're all very, very high, much higher than a lot of other areas. And they all 3 scored Fs for gun rights as well. Now, whether that is a nature of the rural community is not necessarily the case. I'm just saying, again, these are correlations. I would like to repeat and reiterate that a lot of these are things that you can't necessarily say is a cause or a direct cause. Like just because you live in the South does not mean that you're going to inherently like get a gun and shoot somebody with it. It is just that there's a clear connection where like you can see patterns and themes. And then lastly, looking at the map, more densely populated states have higher amounts of gun violence overall. So that's important to keep in mind as well. Just because you have harsh gun laws does not mean that you are free of gun violence, according to the map. You look at California, they have 3,184 people killed with guns that year. Texas, 3,353, and Florida, 2,704. And those are the 3 most populated states in the country. In comparison, the 3 least populated states, Wyoming, Vermont, and North Dakota, Wyoming had 101 people killed, Vermont 78, and North Dakota 90. So the size of your population matters as well. But again, these are 2 different statistics. Keep in mind, rate of gun violence is different than total gun violence. You can have a lot of people die from gun violence because you have a large population. There's just more people to shoot each other, but still overall have the percent or the rate be lower. So that's important to keep in mind with those statistics. For the actual like people involved with gun violence and the acts of gun violence themselves, the majority of gun-related deaths are suicide-based. So again, that's something to keep in mind, is why does someone commit suicide? Is it because of bullying? Is it because of depression? Is it because of mental issues? Those are things to consider, because 62% of this year so far, 62% of our deaths related to guns are related to suicide. And the other 38% is due to homicides. The majority of deaths also are legal adults. So it is around 97% are people above the age of 18, which also for most gun laws, as you should have hopefully seen, is about the age where you are allowed to acquire a gun. So this can kind of tell you that, again, the gun violence, the people being killed, is people who can legally acquire guns. It does not, a large percent of the population is young kids or teenagers stealing guns and then accidentally killing themselves. And that should hopefully be visible too. We're going to skip a bullet point in the fact that the vast majority of homicides are intentional. Only 1% of all homicides from this year so far resulted due to accidental shootings. So it's just not a thing. Generally speaking, when you look at the data surrounding gun violence, it is not a result of accidents. It is a very, very small percentage of the time, which also at the same time, it is important to note that a very, very small percentage of that has to do with police homicides. It's in the news a lot and it gets a lot of attention. So it kind of blows it sometimes out of proportion. But when you look at the numbers, 6% of homicides this year were a result of police shooting at the person committing the crime and resulting in their death. So overall, you can kind of take these patterns that southern areas tend to be higher in rates of gun violence. Larger areas have more gun violence. Totals, like numbers of people. And then on top of that, suicides and adults killing each other outside of the police or accidents are the vast majority of our gun-related problems. So again, thinking back to those questions, you need to be saying to yourself, okay, so what's the problem? Is it who we let have access to it? Do we need to bump up the age? Not necessarily, because it doesn't seem like young people are really causing the problems. Do we need to adjust our assistance for those with suicide or suicidal tendencies, or identifying that potentially because it is a large number of guns? Or do we just not let people with suicidal tendencies have access to guns? Does that potentially solve it? These are the things you need to be thinking. From there, we'll end with the gun laws that you guys looked at. And in particular, what sort of conclusions you can draw from those gun laws. And looking at them and then also comparing that to the maps and the state-based violence, what you can kind of tell is that permits to purchase do not necessarily correlate with a decrease in violence. And so what I mean by that is you should have noticed in your laws that California does not require a permit to purchase a firearm. Same with Nevada. Only Illinois requires you to have one. And by a permit, I mean like a FOID card, where you have to have identification saying, I have been given approval to purchase this firearm. However, California has the lowest rate of gun violence in the state at 7.8. Nevada has one of the higher ones at 16.8, sorry, country, and then Illinois is right in the middle at 11.7. So clearly, permits don't necessarily do anything, because you have someone with a permit being in the middle, you have someone without permits being real bad, but then also someone without permits being the lowest rates of gun violence in the nation. Along with that, owner licenses do not correlate with a decrease in violence. So if you require a license to own a firearm, that will not do anything. Same sort of deal here, where California does not require them, Illinois does, Nevada does not, and you see the same sort of split where the polar ends have similar rules, so that doesn't do anything. What does seem to potentially have a correlation with decreased gun violence are weapon restrictions and waiting periods. And again, correlation is not causation. What I mean by that is that there seems to be a connection that when you have waiting periods or additional restrictions, gun violence does go down, but there's a lot of additional details that go into that. So you have to account for those as well. However, there is this sort of pattern where California has very strict rules on what sort of weapons people have access to. They have an assault weapon ban, they have a large capacity mag ban, and they have the lowest. Illinois does not have an assault weapon ban. We do not have a large mag ban, but we do have some additional restrictions, and we're right in the middle. And then Nevada doesn't have any of those, and they're at that 16.8 area. So you do see kind of a progressive increase with progressive reduction in restrictions. Similarly, California and Illinois both do have waiting periods, while Nevada does not, and they both have lower rates than Nevada, who is one of the higher. Not the highest, but one of the higher. And so you can kind of see that there is at least something to consider. You have to not necessarily say it is a cause, but it is worth considering when you look at these, like, okay, so there is signs that perhaps gun laws do affect this. So now let's look deeper at this as you're formulating your opinion. Is it just the gun laws, or is it the fact that they also have better mental health assistance, that they have better training programs? So these are all things that you need to be considering and looking for those patterns back at your data, looking at all those details you had to fill out and saying, okay, what seems to be kind of the like trend between these? What does Illinois share with California? What does Nevada not have that the other two do? Things like that. And all of this should be helping you to kind of formulate your opinion about, again, those main questions. All this should lead back to, is there a way to solve the gun violence problem, and does gun control help with that? Does gun control help deal with the mentally ill? Does it help deal with the fact that they had access to them, or that rifles are the source of most casualties? Does it help deal with the fact that certain areas with less laws seem to be more prone to higher rates? Does it help with the fact that larger cities have larger violence? Does it help with suicidal tendencies? All of that you need to be thinking, where does gun control fit in with those problems? Because these seem to be kind of the core causes of our gun violence problem in the United States. So hopefully you found that helpful. If you didn't, or you have more questions, feel free to email them to me. I didn't receive any this week, so I didn't add in any additional details or things like that. Next week, we're going to be doing the same sort of process, except with overseas statistics now. So like we've looked at what the United States is like, but what about overseas? Are we just this weird sort of anomaly where suicide's really high because of gun violence, but everyone else it's just like murdering each other? Or what's the deal? How do we compare to these places, and how do their gun laws compare to, and what sort of, again, correlations can you draw from their laws and their rates and details like that? So Monday you'll have no assignment because you're still on break. Tuesday and Wednesday you will be doing research on some global mass shootings, similar to how you did for the United States. And then Thursday I'll have some notes posted on YouTube for you guys where I run you through the statistics of gun violence in some of those key countries overseas that are similar to us. And then Friday we'll have another one of these reviews, and this time it will actually be live. So with that in mind, I hope you have a wonderful weekend, a wonderful break and Easter, and I will hear from all of you on Monday. And I try to stop the recording.